Hey guys, welcome back. So today we want to start a video series, just a couple of videos exploring what rifle would the United States military be using in 2022 had we kept our promise to our NATO allies and adopted some version of the FN-FAL. The rifle that I have here is a T48 replica. We're going to take a closer look at the T48, talk about it and the trials against the T44, which will become the M14. And then in the next video, based on your comments down below, we'll explore where would we be if the M16 had never been adopted? Because had we adopted the T48 into the US military and it became the M14, certainly it would have served longer than the 5 years that the M14 served, and that's what led us into the M16. So that's what we want to talk about in this video series. Again, please comment down below. Let us know what you think we would have adopted to replace the FN-FAL had we adopted it as our primary service rifle. If you guys enjoy the content that we produce here at the Military Arms Channel, please take a moment to join our Patreon family. There is a link in the video description below. You'll get early access to videos like this one. You'll have direct access to me. I answer all private communications, among some other perks. Again, there's a link in the video description below. With that being said, let's get started talking about the T48. After World War II, the world got a glimpse of the direction infantry rifles were moving. After the invention of the Fedorov in Russia and the STG-44 in Germany, the world realized that intermediate cartridges that were capable of select fire, meaning they could do semi-automatic or fully automatic, that was the path forward. And so the allies that had defeated the Axis powers during World War II got together and decided they needed to standardize on an infantry rifle and a cartridge for logistic purposes. And that would make a lot of sense. So not to get too wordy about the history of this, you can find much of this information online. If you just Google T44, T48 trials, you'll get a lot of this backstory. But ultimately, the United States made a promise to its allies that if the allies would adopt the 308 cartridge, the sub 62x51 NATO, if they would adopt this cartridge, we would adopt the FAL instead of the T44, which ultimately would become the M14 that you see here. This is a 30-06 cartridge, and this is what the original M1 Garand fired. So we kind of stepped it down a little bit and made the 308, what we call the 308, or the 7.62x51 NATO, I'll just call it 308. But this truly isn't an intermediate cartridge. This is still a full power cartridge by any measure. And so when we went to do military trials in the United States, keep in mind, we've already promised our allies that we would adopt, if they take on the 7.62x51, that we would adopt the FAL. We still did our own military trials, and the T44/M14 went up against that FN-FAL that was manufactured in the United States by a couple of different companies, plus FN submitted trials rifles. We wanted to see how feasible the manufacturing would be here in the United States. And so H&R, Harrington and Richardson, would be one of the manufacturers, and High Standard would be another one of the manufacturers, and then of course FN in Belgium. And so we said, okay guys, let's do these trials and let's see if the T44 and the T48 are comparable. And through most of the testing, they were comparable. Keep in mind that the M14 really is nothing more than a modernized M1 Garand. And the thought being that the M1 Garand had carried us through the war. All it needed was a facelift, put a 20-round box magazine in it, make it lock open on last shot fired, use stripper clips as well, and we could make this our select fire intermediate cartridge infantry rifle. And so we kind of cheated a little bit, at least Springfield Armory, not the one in Geneseo, Illinois, but the actual Springfield Armory. We got to the Arctic winter trials, and Springfield Armory had a cold chamber where they could make modifications to the T44, and so they had a few weeks where they were modifying the T44 for extreme cold weather use, and then they went to the Arctic to do cold weather testing, and the FAL, the T48, fell short, and FN tried to hurry up and increase the port size, produce more gas into the system, but that wound up breaking parts because then the guns were overgassed. This would become America's shortest serving infantry rifle. I know everybody's going to say, but we still used it in the war on terror. Yes, we did, but that's because we had to pull them out of the mothballs to do so. This rifle technically served from around 1959 to 1964, 5 years. And so that's what prompted this video series, because this is America's shortest serving infantry rifle. Our NATO allies went ahead and adopted the 7.62x51. And then in 1965, the United States, realizing this was not the right rifle because it was just uncontrollable for most soldiers on full auto, we took the step of adopting the 5.56 after we had already got our allies to adopt the 7.62x51. What a mess that was, and it ruffled some feathers. But this became our infantry rifle. But let's take a closer look at this T48. I don't need to explain the M14 to you guys. Most of you watching already know the history on the rifle and how to shoot one and what they're like. Let's take a closer look at that T48 because it's actually a very interesting version of the FAL. Over the years, you guys have seen me use a lot of primary arms optics, everything from red dot sights to magnified optics. And why do I do that? Well, over the years, they've offered very good products for a very fair price. They have fast shipping, outstanding customer support, and that's why you've seen me using those products for so many years. If you guys would like to pick up a magnified optic like you see on this Daniel Defense Mark 12, you can pick up an optic like this one. Just put it in your cart over at pa.com or primaryarms.com, and if you use the code MAC at checkout, MAC at checkout, you'll get a free scope mount with your optic, and that goes for any Primary Arms branded optic. If you pick up an optic that has an integrated mount, use that code MAC at checkout, and you'll get a free Kill Flash ARD for that optic. So please swing by and check out primaryarms.com. Today we'll be using some 147 grain ball from our friends over at Norma. We'd like to thank them for supplying the ammunition free of charge to the channel. It's really good ammo. Try it out if you see it at your local gun store or if you find some online. Speaking of ammo, this is the T48. This is a trials rifle. This is a replica of one using some of the original parts that were on one of the trials rifles for the build process. But speaking about the cartridge itself, to talk about the 308 or 7.62x51, we have to first talk about what the Brits were doing when they were looking at the FAL themselves. They were looking at a true intermediate cartridge, either the 270 Brit or the 280 Brit. There were a couple of competing cartridges, and they finally settled on the 280 Brit. And I'll throw a picture of one of those cartridges up so you can see it. It looks like a more modern, say, 6.5 Grindle or 6 ARC type round. And it was a true intermediate cartridge. It didn't have the same recoil that the 308 would ultimately have. So the US kind of really screwed up the whole mixture all the way around by not only forcing its alliance partners to adopt a more powerful cartridge, which would make select fire more problematic for most soldiers, meaning more recoil, and after you fire that first or second shot, the rest of the rounds are just going wild. The Brits were onto something with that intermediate cartridge that they were looking at adopting in either their EM2 bullpup rifle or the FAL. But we had to go in and force them to adopt the 308 and mislead them into thinking that we were going to adopt this, when I think most of the military brass at the Pentagon was really favoring the M14 because it was an American rifle and they had something against foreign-made weapons then. And so it was kind of not made here, it didn't originate here syndrome. And some other factors, I think, played into the poor decisions that led our military away from this to the M14 that we know today. This is an example of what we used in our trials, and it has a few features on it that set it apart from some of the other FAL variants out there. Keep in mind, about 90 different nations adopted some version of this rifle during the Cold War. After World War II, up until the 1990s and 2000s, and they're still in service all over the world today, still by a number of different paramilitary groups and some militaries. So this rifle has a couple of things that make it unique to the T48 and the US rifle. Out here we have a long flash hider with a bayonet mount on it, a lightweight profile barrel, standard, pretty much gas plug. These would vary from country to country. We have a protected front sight that is slightly different than some of the other FAL variants, but similar to others. It doesn't use a standard FAL sight tool on the front sight. It has a little square pin that you can screw in. The detents are here on the side. Has a standard FAL gas adjustment here. Here we decided for whatever reason to use wood, and this would be an original wood set from an original T48. It's interesting to note that the gas piston tube is exposed, where if you take a look at the L1A1 and the FN 50.0 match, the commercially sold rifles, their handguards would cover up the gas system and barrel, but on the US version, we left the gas system exposed, perhaps for cooling purposes, who knows. Coming back here, we have the carrying handle, and it has a wood carrying handle on it. The attachment to wood, I think, was a big mistake given the time period. Clearly, after World War II, Bakelite and other polymers were coming online, and wood was kind of a poor choice for a military service rifle just because it absorbs moisture and does other things and rots in certain environments. Polymers were the way forward, but we were still playing with wood for some reason. Coming back here, another interesting feature of the T48 is the completely open system. So it has a non-reciprocating charging handle, it uses metric magazines, and you can see when the bolt locks open that the entire action is open on the gun. Also, they could use stripper clips. And this is just a throwback to the military thinking of the time. This is where old and new really kind of butted heads. There was no need for stripper clips. We had detachable box magazines. Clinging to this World War I mentality was just goofy to me, at the expense of leaving the entire action of a weapon open when it locked open on last round fire, and say a soldier goes to the ground to reload, it's just left wide open for stuff to get in there. It makes more sense the way most militaries adopted this rifle, with the top cover covering up everything but the ejection port, thus not allowing so much debris getting into the action of the gun. Another interesting feature, and does use metric magazines, another interesting feature of the T48 would be its trigger guard. You'll notice there's a big hole here in the pistol grip, and that's so you can take the trigger guard down and tuck it in there, and that's for a winter trigger. So if you have a mitten or thick gloves, you don't have a trigger guard interfering with your ability to access the trigger of the firearm, something that the M16 would also adopt. Put it back, just kind of push it up there and flex it, wiggle it around until it pops back into place. Back here, standard fare FAL rear sight and wood stocks that you would see on some of the L1A1s and some of the Commonwealth guns before they went to polymer themselves. So those are pretty much the biggest things. The gun does have a last round hold open. Some versions of the rifle would not. This one does. So it will lock open on last shot fired, and then it has a mag release right here that's very easy to access and very familiar to FAL users. So that's the T48 in a nutshell. And that's the backstory on how we wound up where we were with the M14. Now the discussion needs to turn to, well, had we adopted this rifle, certainly it would have lasted in service for more than 5 years. This was the superior rifle to the M14. We probably would have continued to use it probably into the 80s like many of our allies. The M16 never would have happened. So what would we have adopted? Please comment down below. What do you think the U.S. military would have adopted? A new cartridge and a new rifle. What would it look like? That's what we want to talk about in the next video in this series. I get asked all the time, Mac, how can I get involved in the firearms industry? Well, there's no easy answer, but one way you can easily get involved in the firearms industry is to become a certified gunsmith. Modern Gun School has been teaching gunsmiths since 1945. It is accredited college, and also if you're a veteran and have a GI Bill, you can use that to enroll at Modern Gun School. So please swing by and check them out. I have a link in the video description below. So the whole premise of this video series is to have a discussion about what the United States military would be using today had the M16 never been developed and never been issued as the M16. So what would we do? What would we be using in 2022 as an infantry rifle? Would we still be using some version of the FAL? Would we have ditched the 308 and gone to a cartridge more like the 280 Brit or something like that? Or would we have adopted an entirely different weapon system? And if that's the case, what would that weapon system look like? That's what I really want to hear from you guys about in the comments. And then after we read some of those comments, I'll share my thoughts on it in the next video in this series. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video talking about the T48, the T44, and the AR-15 M16. Again, I really look forward to those comments. If you guys would like to support us here at the Military Arms Channel, please consider becoming part of our Patreon family. Link in the video description below. Also, right here on YouTube, you got that little join button underneath the video player you're watching right now. Mash that join button, and you can support us here on YouTube. And last but not least, guys, please swing by and check out coppercustom.com. Thank you for 14 years of support. We'll talk to you guys soon.